Here we are, almost 37 years married, and we still have to remind ourselves that we have these tendencies that really go back to our childhood stories.
And we can't blame everything on childhood, but our story is where we come from. So just begin to notice what things you say, how you act that are related to where you come from. That's really what it is. Welcome to The Inspired Marriage. I'm Diane Hollenbeck.
And I'm Kevin Hollenbeck.
And we want to help successful couples be more satisfied in their marriage. In today's episode, we're going to talk about our stories. So what is that? It's our history, and our history, without knowing it, can cause a lot of problems. It can create emotional distance. It can really increase conflict when you don't understand someone's story or your partner's story. This could look like a lack of understanding or emotional distance, even isolation. Today, one of the things we're really going to focus on is money and how our different childhoods really affected our view of money and how that story impacts our marriage.
Self-awareness is a funny thing, and so much of life is on autopilot. And it just happens, especially as adults. I mean, I brushed my teeth this morning. It happens the same way every day. And I think a lot of life is like that. It just kind of happens automatically. But my way of doing it isn't necessarily your way of doing it.
That's right. And so we really want to start with a funny story about birth order, right?
Well, I'm a firstborn, right? I'm the oldest of four. So I have two brothers that were a year and a half and then a year and a half behind me. So the three boys, we grew up in the family in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and I grew up in a middle-class family. And then my sister came along about 6.5 years later. So there's 9.5 years between me and my youngest sibling, my sister. And we grew up in a middle-class family. The three boys were kind of doing our thing. Our sister came along later and became very much a part of the family, and of course still is. And so there's a real dynamic with that. But firstborn means that you're of course the golden child when you're firstborn, because my parents did want me. But then the number two comes along, and I'm no longer king of the throne, right? Then my brother behind me, and then of course another brother came, so he gets dethroned, and then we have the next one. And so if you ever read the birth order book by Dr. Kevin Lehman, you would see that matters. So I'm a firstborn. In a middle-class family where my dad, and mom were together. And that's kind of what my history is as I come into our marriage.
Yeah, but that brings a dynamic, right? So the reason that story is important is because it informs who we are and how we relate to each other. So Kevin's dynamic as a firstborn is very different than mine as the second to last born, right? So your dynamic is really about needing to do things right.
Yeah, well, I needed to do things right, follow the rules, and if the three of us were playing and doing something, and we got in trouble in any way, right? We were doing something that wasn't right. Even if one of my younger brothers, in fact, normally it was the case, they were the ones that started the problem. It was never my fault.
Always.
But when my mom or dad came in, it was, Kevin, you should have known better. And so whenever the punishment or the structure, the thing was, I was supposed to know better. And of course, I was a little older, and that may have been true, but I got the blame. So as a result, and as typical of firstborns, you tend to be over-responsible and follow the rules is kind of the natural thing. And the expectation is that I do the right things. And of course, then in school, I performed well. I got the good grades, which then my brothers resented, right? Because then Kevin's the golden boy. And so these dynamics happened in my family, and I bring this into our marriage then.
Yeah, and the way I experience that is so interesting because to me it seems like Kevin needs to be in control when really he just wants to be responsible, right? So now if I understand Kevin's story, I have more compassion for that. I can listen for when does he feel like he's in trouble? You know what I mean? It's not like, oh, I'm going to treat him like a child, but because I know his childhood story, I'm going to give real attention to that, right? I'm going to listen for the dynamic. It's like, oh, I must have done something wrong. It must be my fault. That plays out as a hidden dynamic in a marriage. For me, I grew up the second to the youngest in a family of 8. with a lot of brothers and 2 sisters. And for me, everything was about permissions. I needed to ask for permission. We grew up in rural upstate New York with not a lot, so we didn't have a lot of money. So you didn't just buy things, right? And so we have a really funny story. I was pouring rain one day. We were at an amusement park, and I said to Kevin, "Can I buy an umbrella?" And this just shows dynamic and how story relates to a hidden dynamic. And he just looked at me like, "Well, buy an umbrella if you need to." But my dynamic as one of the younger of a big family with not a lot of resources is ask for permissions. So it's something I have to learn to grow out of. But it's something, if I tell that story to Kevin, the reason I do this is why. But first I have to have this awareness. And wow, it's very powerful. If you look at it and you start to understand if maybe it's about money like it is for me. So Kevin spends what he needs. If he loses his earbuds, he buys new ones. If he needs a new bike, he buys a new bike. If I need a new bike, I ask for permission, right? I'll spend a little bit of money a lot of the time, but Kevin we have a problem with commas, right? Like Kevin can spend thousands, and I'm like, what about this $100? And that it's not to say that that's a bad thing, but it's a dynamic, right? Middle class, not a lot of means, and so for us, money has been a very interesting issue because we end up working out of our childhood dynamic, right? And so Kevin's like, well, just buy what you need, but then I'm looking at it in a different way. Do you want to add anything to that?
I think it can be pretty frustrating, when the other person thinks about something differently. So, I'm like, well, you're wet. Buy an umbrella, right? I mean, it just like that's, and it's an amusement park, and umbrellas are probably $50 when they should be 10, right? So there is all of that dynamic, but still, to me, it's that way. And I think, Diane, the thing is I need to understand you, right? And so rather than be frustrated, I mean, I think we have to talk about it. That's part of what we're doing here and understand. And yes, you said you need to grow and I need to grow, but part of it is also just understanding. And so I think I've learned this story. We've talked about, and we're going to do that a lot in today's podcast here. We're going to talk about how story kind of happens. And I think it's important to our listeners to think about why is Diane that way in this case, and to understand the story, not in a judgmental way, but frankly, if I had grown up the way you had, I would probably be like you in a lot of ways, right? And the same thing. And so instead of being like, why can't she make a decision to buy a cheap umbrella? It's like, I need to be compassionate and understanding, and we just nurture and talk through it. And by the way, you've got much better at spending.
I've gotten much better at spending money. Yes, it's great. I've been given so many permissions.
Yeah, that's
but
good.
I love the word you said, understanding. Like when we can bring understanding, when I can say to you, first of all, I need to be aware of what's making me tick about money. Well, how is this? And then so me as a person in a marriage, I need to unpack my own things, right? And I didn't figure out the umbrella story for a lot of years. Like I asked for permission to buy a pair of shoes, to buy this, to buy that. And I'm just like, now I see a pattern of relating where it's exposing a dynamic really from childhood. And like, we can't blame everything on childhood. That's not it. But our story is where we come from, right? So just begin to notice what things you say, how you act that are related to where you come from. That's really what it is.
Yeah, and just to take this money story one step further, recently we've had some significant expenditures going on in a piece of real estate. And what you said to me very recently, like maybe even this morning, was, hey, can we talk about these things before you go spend the money, right? And so I think that in the old world, again, I need to be more sensitive to that's helpful for you. And so we will talk, and I've committed to that we'll talk about those things. But early in our marriage, I would just go do what we needed to do. Of course we did. And you would be, kind of asking permission. And that created an inequity, frankly, in how we experience things. And so this little dynamic, like something as simple as the umbrella story, we call it, really has impacted and even still impacts our marriage, but we're more aware of it, and that's the key. And we still, again, we are who we are. We're developed by the time we're, 5 or 6 years old in some ways, but our tendencies are there, but now we can appreciate, understand, and I can accommodate and say, yeah, I agree to that. And by the way, my habits of spending money freely haven't always gone very well, and so your cautious nature is not by any means all bad. And so, it's all worked out and continues to work out. But the point is here we are, almost 37 years married, and we still have to remind ourselves that we have these tendencies that really go back to our childhood stories.
And this is another dynamic when you were talking about inequity. There's a real power inequity there, right? Because I was a trad wife, the expression now running around, buzzing around. Traditional wife, stayed at home. Kevin made all the money. So what is my tendency already from childhood to ask for permissions? And then to think in my mind, oh, well, we aren't equal partners in money. But if we're married, depending on the agreements you make, right? If you have a joint bank account, you have equity, right? You're equal partners. And so this is a very sticky issue. And I think it's a really good one to unpack about money, about your personal story, right? Because my personal story says there's not enough, better be careful, better ask for permission. And Kevin's story is very much, I'm independent, I'm going to make money, and I'm going to do things, and I'm going to decide. So I'm a consensus person with money, and Kevin's an independent thinker, which is why it came up today, this morning, 4 hours ago. Listen, I like that you make these decisions, but I need buy-in. You need to ask about the how and the when, right? Not just, of course, we can spend the money if we have it, but these are such good questions because some of the conflicts we have are actually based on our story, right? If we could understand not just, how to avoid conflict. No, sometimes we avoid conflict because we don't know the other person's story. Right? So be really careful as you think about your conversations and the way you relate about money and even chores around the house. That's a whole nother story about how these conflicts might be related to your personal story.
Hey, we hope you enjoyed this session that we just had together. And if you found it helpful, we'd love to interact with you more. So certainly like and follow us and click on the link below where you can sign up for our upcoming newsletter and maybe even engage us in a community we're going to be building soon where you can share your stories, learn from others who also want to improve their marriages.
So thanks for joining us today on The Inspired Marriage. Diane
and Kevin Hollenbeck.